Little girl whispered through tears, "My mom is scared." The Hell's Angel did the unthinkable. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a cold, rainy night, the kind that cuts through the bones and leaves you shivering in its wake, a young girl's voice echoed through the silence of the streets. "My mom is scared." The desperation in her voice made every word sound like a plea for help, each syllable heavier than the last. The words were barely audible, lost in the howling wind, but they carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. A few blocks away, a man on a motorcycle heard her voice, the sharpness of her fear cutting through the roar of his Harley-Davidson's engine. The Hell's Angel known as Jake Reaper Morrison was used to riding through the darkest parts of the city, where danger lurked in every corner, but something about this night felt different. As he slowed down, his eyes scanned the wet street ahead, and there, huddled under the dim light of a flickering street lamp, he saw her. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, with wide, terrified eyes and tears streaming down her face. She stood alone, trembling as if the chill of the night wasn't enough to explain her fear. Jake stopped his bike, the engine growling as he killed the throttle. He could see her clearly now, her small hands clutching a stuffed bear, her knuckles white from the pressure. "Hey kid," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the still night air. She flinched, instinctively taking a step back, her fear making her hesitant. She had every reason to be scared. The stories about Hell's Angels were everywhere. Dangerous men in leather jackets, people who didn't care about the rules, men who made trouble wherever they went. But Jake wasn't one of those men anymore. Not tonight. Not when there was something more important at stake. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you," Jake said, his voice softer this time. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she was sizing him up, wondering if she could trust him. She was a smart kid. "Where's your mom?" Jake asked, his heart suddenly feeling heavy with the weight of the unknown. She pointed shakily to a rundown house at the end of the street. The light was off, but Jake could make out the silhouette of a figure in the window. Her mom was in there, somewhere, waiting for help. "She's scared," the girl whispered, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I don't know what happened to her." Jake's chest tightened. Something wasn't right. He'd seen fear before, but this was different. There was a desperation in the girl's words, something that told him this wasn't just a random act of panic. She wasn't just afraid of the dark. She was afraid of something much worse. Without a second thought, Jake climbed off his bike, his boots crunching on the wet pavement as he approached the little girl. "It's okay," he repeated, bending down to her level, trying to reassure her. "We'll get her some help. Stay close to me, all right?" The girl nodded, her wide eyes never leaving his face. Jake could tell she didn't quite believe him, but she was willing to follow him. He helped her onto the back of his bike, the girl holding tightly onto his jacket as they rode toward the house. The rain had started to pick up, falling harder now, as if the world itself was trying to drown out the fear that lingered in the air. They arrived at the house, and Jake immediately dismounted, looking around. The front door was cracked open, and through the small gap, he could hear the faint sound of someone crying. The girl's mother. His instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly, knocking on the door with the knuckles of his leather-gloved hand. There was no answer at first, just silence. Then, from inside, a voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "Please, just go away." Jake's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly, his voice steady, the command clear in his tone. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside, with the girl following closely behind him. The room was dim, the smell of stale air and mildew thick in the space. And there, on the floor, lay the girl's mother, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. A deep bruise marked her cheek, and her clothes were torn, but what struck Jake the most was the fear in her eyes. The kind of fear that told him this wasn't just a momentary panic. Something had happened here, something that needed to be fixed, and fast. The house was still, the only sound the steady patter of rain against the windows. Jake moved quickly but carefully, kneeling next to the woman on the floor. His hands moved with precision, checking for any signs of injury beyond what was visible. The woman's face was ashen, her eyes glazed with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Her breath came in shallow, quick bursts, a sharp contrast to the calm demeanor Jake had adopted. The little girl stood behind him, clutching her stuffed bear, her face pale and fearful. She watched as Jake gently checked her mother's pulse, then turned his attention to her leg, which was twisted at an awkward angle. "She's been hurt badly," Jake muttered to himself. He looked back at the girl. "We need to get her help." The girl's eyes were wide, as if she had only just begun to realize the gravity of the situation. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jake's voice softened. "It's okay. We're going to make sure she's safe. Do you know who did this to her?" The little girl shook her head, her lip trembling. "No, no one. She just started being scared a few days ago. She didn't say why. She told me to stay close, that it wasn't safe outside." Jake's heart sank. He could see the confusion in the girl's eyes, the fear that had nothing to do with just the storm outside, but something deeper, something that had been building up, something that had turned this small home into a place of dread. "I'm going to call for help," Jake said, standing up and walking over to the girl's mother. "Don't worry, you're going to be okay," he reassured her. His phone was already in his hand as he moved outside, stepping into the rain. He dialed the emergency number, speaking quickly but clearly. "This is Jake Morrison. I need an ambulance at 2400 Maple Street. A woman is severely injured. We need immediate medical assistance. She's unconscious, possibly due to trauma or poisoning. And there's a child here too." As he spoke, Jake's mind raced. What had happened here? Why was this woman so terrified? He didn't have time to dwell on it now. The sound of sirens in the distance pulled him back into the moment. He hung up the phone, his eyes scanning the dark street for any signs of danger. He could feel the tension rising in his body, but he kept his cool. He had been in far worse situations than this, and he knew how to handle them. The ambulance arrived just as the rain started to come down harder, the flashing lights illuminating the dark street in sharp, erratic bursts. Jake watched as the paramedics rushed to the door, and he stepped aside, allowing them to take over. They moved quickly, lifting the woman onto a stretcher and checking her vitals. One of the paramedics looked at Jake. "What happened to her?" "I don't know. I found her like this," Jake replied. The paramedic nodded and focused on his work, but Jake could tell there was more to this story. As the paramedics worked, Jake glanced at the girl, who was now sitting on the porch, hugging her knees to her chest. She was staring at her mother, her face a mask of helplessness. Jake walked over to her, crouching down to her level. "Hey, I'm going to stay with you, all right? Everything's going to be okay." The girl nodded but didn't speak. She was too scared to say anything, too scared to move. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, the way her tiny body was trembling from the cold and the shock of everything that had just happened. He put a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer her some comfort, but the girl flinched at his touch. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not your fault," Jake said softly. "You're safe now. Your mom is getting the help she needs." The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of questions. "But who did this to her?" she asked. Jake didn't have an answer. He could guess, but he didn't want to say the words out loud just yet. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew this wasn't over. "I don't know yet," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. "But I'll make sure we find out. You and your mom will be safe, I promise." The ambulance pulled away, and Jake helped the girl back inside the house, where they both sat in silence. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time that night, Jake felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what had happened to the woman, or why the girl was so afraid, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let them face this alone. The rain was still falling heavily, and the sound of it hitting the roof felt like a constant drumbeat, marking the passage of time as Jake sat on the worn couch next to the little girl. She had barely spoken since the paramedics took her mother away, and the silence between them hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Her eyes, wide and fearful, occasionally flickered to the door as if expecting someone to come crashing through at any moment. Jake had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that leaves a person paralyzed, unable to take action or speak. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just an observer. He was here to protect her. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. It was a text from the paramedic who had attended to the woman. She's stable for now. But there's something off about the whole situation. It doesn't add up. I'll be in touch. Jake read the message, his gut tightening. Something wasn't right, but he wasn't sure what it was yet. He put the phone back in his pocket and turned his attention back to the girl. You doing okay? He asked, his voice calm but concerned. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at the floor, her fingers tightly gripping the stuffed bear in her lap. Finally, she looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Is she going to be okay? Jake leaned forward slightly, giving her the reassurance he hoped would bring her some comfort. She's in good hands now. The doctors will take care of her. She's going to be okay. The girl nodded slowly, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. What happened to her, mister? Why was she so scared? Her question hit him like a punch in the stomach. It wasn't just a child's curiosity. It was a genuine plea for understanding, a desperate need for answers to make sense of the chaos. Jake didn't have the answers. Not yet. He had his suspicions, but suspicions weren't enough to explain the kind of fear that had gripped this woman. I don't know, kid, but I promise you, we're going to find out. Jake stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the street. The flashing lights of the ambulance had long faded into the distance, leaving behind only the sound of rain and the distant hum of the city. But in his gut, Jake felt the weight of something much heavier than the storm outside. He wasn't just dealing with a random act of violence or an accident. This was something more, something deeper. The woman's fear had felt personal, like she was running from something much darker than just the rain or the night. And now, the girl was caught in the middle of it. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to focus. He had to protect her. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. He answered without hesitation. Morrison, he said. Jake, it's me. The voice on the other end of the line said. It was Murphy, an old friend from his time with the Hells Angels. I heard about the situation. You need any help? Jake didn't hesitate. Yeah, I do. There's something off about this whole thing, Murphy. Something's not right. The woman's in the hospital, but I need more information. She's terrified, and I don't think it's just from being hurt. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I'll dig around, Murphy said. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Jake hung up the phone and turned back to the girl. She was still sitting there, the bear clutched tightly in her arms. Her eyes were closed now, but Jake could tell she was still awake, still processing everything that had happened. He walked over and sat down beside her again. I know it's scary, he said softly, his voice steady. But you're safe now. You don't have to worry about anything happening to you. The girl turned her head slightly, her eyes filled with doubt. But what if something happens to her? What if she's in trouble? Jake felt a pang of guilt at the question. He couldn't lie to her. I don't know yet, he said, his voice quiet. But I'll make sure nothing happens to you. And I'll make sure your mom is safe too. She nodded slowly, as if taking in his words, but Jake could see that the doubt still lingered in her eyes. The sound of the rain against the window seemed to fill the room again, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jake sat there, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening, whatever had happened to this woman, it wasn't over. And he wasn't going to let it end with the girl sitting alone in a dark house. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many things that didn't make sense. He stood up again, taking a long look at the girl before walking to the door. Stay here. I'll be right back, he said, his voice firm. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Please don't leave me, she whispered. Jake's heart ached, but he gave her a reassuring smile. I'm not going anywhere, he said. As he walked out the door, he didn't know what he was about to uncover, but he was damn sure he wouldn't stop until he did. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle by the time Jake stepped out of the house. His boots splashed through the puddles as he made his way down the street, his mind still racing. There were too many unanswered questions, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of urgency that wasn't tied to the usual chaos of his past life. This was different. There was something personal about this, something more than just a simple act of violence or a random encounter. The woman's terror had been genuine, and the girl's fear was even more so. He had to figure out what had really happened here. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of his Hell's Angel patch. It was a symbol that had always represented power, respect, and loyalty, things he no longer cared about as much. But tonight, he needed every bit of that strength to get to the truth. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. It was Murphy. I've got some information for you, Murphy said on the other end of the line. This is bigger than we thought. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He asked, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. The woman, she's been involved with some bad people, Murphy continued. And I don't mean the usual street thugs. These guys have connections, serious ones. They're not going to let this go quietly. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He had suspected as much. The fear in the woman's eyes, the way she had begged him not to call the cops, all of it pointed to something much darker. Where do I find them? Jake asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation. I've got a few leads, Murphy said. But it's going to take some time to pull everything together. You need to keep an eye on the kid. She's going to be safe with you for now, but you don't want to let her out of your sight. Jake glanced back at the house. He knew Murphy was right. He couldn't leave the girl alone, not with whatever was coming. He'd made a promise to her mother, and now, he had to follow through. I'm on it, Jake replied. Keep me posted. He ended the call and stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle in. The girl was waiting for him back inside, and Jake wasn't about to let her face whatever was coming alone. He took a deep breath and walked back toward the house. As he entered, he found the little girl still sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. She hadn't moved since he left, her small shoulders shaking slightly, as if the weight of everything was too much for her to bear. He walked over and sat beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. How are you doing? He asked, his voice soft. She didn't answer at first, but after a long pause, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't want to be alone, she whispered. Jake's heart ached as he placed a hand on her shoulder, gently squeezing. You're not alone, he said, his voice steady. I'm right here. I won't let anything happen to you. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. Will my mom be okay? She asked, her voice cracking with fear. Jake took a deep breath. She's in good hands. The doctors are taking care of her. The girl nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. Jake knew she was scared, but he couldn't lie to her, not about this. He had to protect her, and that meant he needed to stay focused. He had no idea what kind of trouble they were in, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy to get out of. You stay here and stay safe, Jake said, standing up. I need to take care of a few things. I'll be right back. The girl nodded again, but this time, she didn't speak. She just watched him as he walked toward the door. Jake's hand lingered on the knob for a moment, but he didn't turn around. He had to keep going. He couldn't let fear control him now. He had to find the truth, no matter what it took. As he stepped out into the night, the rain had completely stopped, leaving the air thick and still. The city was quiet now, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the occasional crack of thunder from the storm that had passed. But Jake knew the real storm was just beginning. Whoever had hurt this woman, whoever was behind the fear that had gripped her, they weren't going to let this slide. He had to act fast before things got worse. He climbed onto his Harley, his mind already calculating the next steps. He needed information, and he wasn't going to wait around for it to come to him. He had his own ways of digging up the truth. He revved the engine and sped off, the roar of the bike echoing through the empty streets. The darkness seemed to stretch ahead of him, but he didn't hesitate. He had a mission now, and he wouldn't stop until it was finished. For the girl, for her mother, and for the truth that he was determined to uncover. The night was growing colder, and the streets seemed even more desolate as Jake rode through the city, the low hum of his Harley filling the silence. His mind was racing, his thoughts a whirlwind of what he had learned and what he still needed to uncover. The woman's terrified eyes, the girl's shaky voice, they had all pointed to something darker than he had imagined. There was more at play here than just a random act of violence. Jake knew it, felt it deep in his gut. He had to find out what it was, and fast. He turned down a narrow alleyway, his headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rusted metal of old buildings that had long been forgotten. Jake's contact, Murphy, had promised him information, but Jake didn't trust waiting around. In his line of work, it was always better to take matters into his own hands. His bike roared through the alley as he approached an old, dimly lit warehouse. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he could sense the presence of something, someone, watching. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he pulled up to the entrance. There was no sign of life, no movement, but Jake knew better than to let his guard down. He killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after the loud roar of his bike. Stepping off, he surveyed the area, looking for any signs of trouble. He was about to take a step toward the warehouse when he heard a faint sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Jake turned just in time to see a figure step out of the shadows. A man wearing a long coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Jake Morrison, right?" the man asked, his voice low and cautious. Jake didn't answer at first. He had learned long ago to be careful with strangers, especially ones who knew his name. The man took a step closer, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I got a message for you. Something about the woman and the kid." That was enough to grab Jake's attention. He narrowed his eyes, his instincts kicking in. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice steady. The man smirked, an almost amused expression crossing his face. "Does it matter?" "It does if you want to keep breathing," Jake shot back, his tone cold. The man held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, big guy. I'm not here to start a fight. I'm just the messenger." Jake wasn't buying it, but he didn't have time to waste either. "What's the message?" he asked, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "The woman, she's connected. Not just to some random bad guys. We're talking bigger than that. The kind of people who have their hands in everything from politics to crime, and they're not going to let her get away." Jake's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the weight of the situation hit him harder. "What do you mean, get away?" Jake asked, his voice tight with urgency. "She's in danger. And so is the kid," the man replied, his eyes darting around nervously. "There's a reason she didn't want you calling the cops. If you think this is just a domestic thing, you're wrong. This is a bigger game, and the stakes are much higher." Jake's mind spun as the man's words sank in. The woman had been terrified, so terrified that she had begged him not to call the authorities. She had known something. Known someone was after her. The kid. Jake looked back to where the girl was waiting for him, back at the house. She didn't deserve any of this. "Where are they now?" Jake asked, his voice low, determined. The man hesitated before answering. "I don't know exactly, but they're looking for her. And they'll find her if you don't move fast." Jake didn't waste another second. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, makeshift business card, a number written in black ink. "This is a contact. They'll help you, but only if you move fast." "Who is this?" Jake asked, taking the card. "Someone who can help," the man said, stepping back into the shadows. "But remember, this goes both ways. You help them, they help you. Don't get caught in the middle." The man disappeared into the darkness before Jake could ask any more questions. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the card in his hand. He wasn't sure who this mysterious contact was, but he knew he couldn't waste time trying to figure it out. He had to act. For the woman. For the girl. Without another word, Jake turned and walked back to his bike. He mounted it quickly, his mind already shifting gears, thinking through his next steps. Whoever was behind this, whoever had done this to the woman and had caused so much fear in the little girl, they weren't going to get away with it. Not on his watch. He revved the engine and sped off, the wind whipping past him. As he rode through the night, the city lights flickered in the distance, but Jake wasn't looking at them. His focus was entirely on what lay ahead. He had a mission now, and he wasn't going to stop until he saw it through. The darkness ahead of him seemed to grow larger with every turn, but Jake didn't hesitate. He was ready for whatever came next. The night had become thick with tension as Jake sped down the highway, his Harley roaring beneath him. The city had faded behind him, replaced by empty roads and the dark stretch of wilderness ahead. His mind kept replaying the conversation with the mysterious messenger, his words lingering like a shadow that Jake couldn't shake. He was deep in thought, trying to piece together the puzzle that was starting to unfold. The woman, her terrified eyes, the girl who had seen more fear than a child should ever have to bear. It all pointed to something bigger than he had initially realized. The danger wasn't just from thugs or random criminals. No, this was an organized, calculated threat, one that stretched far beyond the life of a single woman or child. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, his thoughts sharp and clear. He had made a promise to the girl's mother. He had promised to protect her, to find out what was happening, and to make sure she was safe. He couldn't break that promise. He was done running from his past. This was his fight now. Up ahead, the road curved, and the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange sense of urgency. Jake could feel it, like a warning in the air. The rain had stopped, but the silence that followed felt unnerving, as if the world was holding its breath. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled over to the side of the road, quickly reaching for it. It was a message from Murphy. "I've got a lead. The woman, she's tied to something deeper. I'll send you the details." Jake's pulse quickened as he read the message. He didn't need more details to know that things were escalating fast. The question now was how deep this went and who was behind it. The fear in the woman's eyes had been real. And now, her child was caught in the middle of a deadly game. He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. Without hesitation, Jake started the engine again and took off down the road, his mind focused. He didn't know exactly where this road would take him, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He was going to have to fight harder than he ever had before. As the city lights disappeared behind him, Jake's phone buzzed again. He glanced down, his heart pounding in his chest as he read the new message. "The people looking for the woman, they're not just after her. They're after the kid too. Whatever she knows, it's valuable. They won't stop until they have both of them." Jake's stomach dropped. He had known they wouldn't stop with just the woman. But now, the threat was personal. They wanted the girl. He had to get to her before they did. He increased his speed, his determination growing stronger. The highway stretched out before him like a black ribbon, winding through the mountains. He could see the distant glow of lights ahead. A small town, a place where he could regroup, figure out his next move. He had to protect the girl. He couldn't let her fall into the hands of whatever organization was behind this. He would fight to the end. As Jake entered the town, he slowed down, keeping his eyes peeled for anything unusual. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, and the flickering streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He was being watched. He parked his bike a few blocks from the local diner, keeping his head down as he walked toward the building. The door creaked open as he stepped inside. The warm glow of the diner's lights a sharp contrast to the cold, dark night outside. The smell of coffee and grease filled the air. Jake scanned the room, his eyes landing on a man sitting alone at the counter. The man was wearing a leather jacket, but something about him felt off. Jake could tell he wasn't just a regular diner-goer. The man's eyes flicked up, meeting Jake's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man gave a subtle nod, signaling for Jake to sit. Jake didn't hesitate. He slid onto the stool beside the man, his muscles tense, ready for anything. "You looking for someone?" the man asked, his voice low. "I'm looking for answers," Jake replied. "The woman, the kid, they're in danger. I need to know who's behind this." The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he took a long sip of his coffee, his gaze shifting to the window, as if making sure they weren't being watched. "This is bigger than you think," the man said finally, his voice gravelly. "They've got eyes everywhere. And they're not just after the woman. They're after the girl too. She knows something. Something they don't want getting out." Jake's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. "Who are they?" he pressed. "It's not just some gang, Morrison," the man said. "We're talking about people with power, people who've been in this game for a long time. If you think you're going to take them down just like that, you're wrong." Jake's fist clenched. He wasn't looking for easy answers. But this was a whole new level of danger. He wasn't backing down. "Not now. I've got a few connections. But you need to be careful," the man continued. "The girl's life is on the line. And so is hers. You make one wrong move, and it's over for both of them." Jake stared at the man, taking in his words. "I'll take my chances," he said. "I'm not leaving until I find out who's behind this and make sure they're both safe." The man nodded slowly, his eyes betraying a hint of respect. "You're brave, Morrison. But this is going to be worse than you think. Get ready for a fight." Jake stood up, his determination unwavering. He wasn't going to stop until he got to the bottom of this. Not for the woman, not for the girl, and certainly not for the people who were pulling the strings from the shadows. He left the diner, his mind already focused on the next move. The fight was just beginning. Jake's mind raced as he left the diner, the man's warning echoing in his thoughts. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The girl's life was in immediate danger. The people behind this were more powerful than he had expected, and the more he uncovered, the darker it became. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he mounted his Harley, the engine roaring to life beneath him. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror as he sped down the quiet streets, making sure he wasn't being followed. The last thing he needed was a tail. He had to stay ahead of whatever was coming. As he turned onto a main road, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Murphy. They know you're looking into them. Be careful. I'm sending you more info. You're running out of time. Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened. This wasn't just a race against time. It was a race against the clock on the lives of the woman and the girl. He had no choice but to push forward, despite the looming uncertainty. The woman's fear, the girl's trembling voice. It was all too real to ignore. He couldn't let them fall into the hands of these people. The headlights of his bike cut through the darkness as he pulled up to a small, run-down building on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect hideout, hidden away from the prying eyes of the public. It had taken Jake hours to track it down, but he knew this was where he needed to be. He parked his bike out of sight, making sure no one would spot it. As he approached the building, he surveyed the surroundings. There were no guards, no signs of anyone being here. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Jake knew he couldn't afford to underestimate anyone in this game. He moved silently, crouching low to avoid detection. The door to the building was unlocked, which was either a trap or a stroke of luck. Either way, he wasn't taking any chances. Jake pushed it open slowly, the creaking of the old wood barely audible above the sound of his breath. Inside, the building was dimly lit, the air stale and heavy with the smell of mold. He could hear voices, low, muffled, but unmistakable. He didn't know who they were, but Jake's instincts told him they weren't the kind of people he wanted to meet. He moved closer to the voices, his steps careful, his body tensed and ready. As he rounded a corner, he saw them, two men standing over a table, speaking in hushed tones. They didn't notice Jake at first, too caught up in their conversation. Jake took a deep breath and stepped forward. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," one of the men said, his voice cold and detached. "We're not just going to let her walk away. The kid's going to be ours, no matter what it takes." Jake's blood ran cold as the words hit him. The girl. They were talking about her, and they weren't just going to let her go. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he held it in check, knowing he had to stay calm. He needed information. He needed to know who these men were and what they were planning. "I'll make sure she stays quiet," the second man said, his voice thick with authority. "She won't know anything until we're ready." The first man nodded. "And what about the Hell's Angel? We need to deal with him too." Jake's heart stopped for a split second. They knew about him. They knew he was involved. "He's not going to get in our way," the second man replied, his tone confident. "He thinks he's doing the right thing, but he's out of his depth. We'll take care of him when the time comes." Jake clenched his fists, trying to control the surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had to be smart about this. He couldn't just charge in and fight. He needed to know more about their plan, about what they were really after. He took a step back, careful not to make a sound. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. It was Murphy. Jake answered immediately. "What do you have for me?" Jake asked, his voice low. "They've got eyes everywhere, Jake. You need to get out of there. The kid's being moved. They're taking her somewhere safe, but it's not going to be for long. If you want to save her, you have to move now." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had to get to the girl before they did. "Where is she?" Jake demanded. Murphy paused for a moment. "I don't know yet. I'll keep digging, but you're running out of time. You have to act fast." Jake gritted his teeth. He couldn't waste any more time. He couldn't let the girl get away. He had to find her, and fast. He turned on his heels and headed toward the exit, his mind racing as he thought through his options. As he stepped back into the night, he was more determined than ever. The stakes had just gotten higher. The girl's life was in his hands now. Jake couldn't afford to fail. He didn't care who these people were. He didn't care how deep this went. All that mattered now was getting to the girl, getting her to safety. The rest of it would come later. For now, he had one mission: protect her, no matter the cost. Jake's heart pounded as he revved the engine of his Harley, speeding through the darkened streets. His mind was laser-focused on the task ahead, getting to the girl, keeping her safe, no matter what it took. The phone call from Murphy had been a wake-up call. The girl was being moved, and Jake wasn't about to let them get away with it. The city lights flickered behind him as he pushed his bike harder, his eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of movement. Every street, every turn felt like a step closer to the danger that was closing in on him. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to act fast, but he also had to be smart. He wasn't the only one after the girl, and the people he was up against were ruthless. They had already made it clear they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. As he approached a crossroads, his phone buzzed again, and he didn't hesitate to answer. Jake. The voice on the other end was tight with urgency. They're taking her to the warehouse on Riverside Drive. You need to move now. Jake's pulse quickened. Riverside Drive. He knew the place well, an abandoned warehouse district, the perfect spot for shady dealings. It was a ghost town, quiet and isolated, the kind of place where no one would hear a thing. I'm on my way, Jake said, slamming the throttle and steering his bike onto the main road that led out of the city. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Time was running out, and he couldn't afford to fail. He had already come too far. The girl was relying on him now, and he wasn't going to let her down. As he sped toward Riverside Drive, his thoughts raced. The men he had overheard in the warehouse earlier had spoken about the girl with a chilling sense of entitlement. They wanted her for something he still didn't understand. But he knew it couldn't be good. She was a pawn in a game that was far bigger than her, far bigger than him. And yet, here he was, fighting to save her life, even though he knew the odds were against him. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a dark, foreboding shape against the night sky. The only sound was the roar of his bike as he approached. He slowed down as he neared the entrance, keeping to the shadows, making sure no one could see him. He parked his Harley out of sight and moved cautiously toward the building. He didn't trust anything about this place. Everything about it screamed danger. As he crept closer, Jake could hear voices inside the warehouse. Deep, hushed tones, the kind that made his skin crawl. He pressed himself flat against the wall, his breath steady, trying to hear what they were saying. You're sure she's the one? A man's voice asked. She's the one, another man replied. The boss wants her. And once we have her, everything changes. Jake's stomach twisted at the words. They were talking about the girl, but what did they mean by everything changes? Whatever it was, it couldn't be good. He needed answers. He needed to find out who was pulling the strings. As the voices faded into the background, Jake knew it was time to move. He had to get inside, get to the girl, and get out. There was no time to waste. He glanced around the corner, his eyes scanning for any guards or threats. The coast was clear. He carefully made his way to the side entrance of the warehouse, where a rusted door was barely ajar. Jake pushed it open quietly, slipping inside. The interior of the warehouse was dark, but he could make out vague shapes moving in the distance. He crouched low, his footsteps silent as he moved deeper into the building. The sound of footsteps echoed ahead, and Jake pressed himself against a stack of old crates, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He waited for the men to pass, his muscles tense, ready for whatever might come next. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps faded, and Jake continued his approach. The warehouse was eerily silent, and the only sound was the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. The deeper he went, the more he could feel the weight of the danger pressing in around him. He finally reached the center of the warehouse, where a single light hung from the ceiling, casting an eerie glow over the scene. And there she was, the girl, sitting in the corner, her hands tied, her eyes wide with fear. A man stood nearby, his back to her, talking to someone on the phone. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw her. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and yet there was a spark of defiance in her eyes. She hadn't given up. Jake felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let this stand. He wasn't going to let them take her. The man on the phone hung up and turned toward her. That was Jake's moment. He lunged from the shadows, his body moving faster than the man could react. With a quick, sharp movement, Jake knocked him out cold, the man crumpling to the floor without a sound. Jake rushed to the girl's side, quickly cutting the ropes that bound her wrists. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You came, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his gaze softening as he gently helped her to her feet. I promised, he said quietly, and I keep my promises. Just as he was about to lead her out, a voice shouted from across the room. Hey! Jake turned just in time to see more men emerging from the shadows, their eyes narrowing as they spotted him. He wasn't getting out of this one without a fight. Jake's heart raced as he heard the men's voices grow louder, closing in on him. The girl, now free from the ropes, looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. But there was a glimmer of trust in them, a silent acknowledgement that she was relying on him. His grip tightened on the knife he had used to cut her loose, his muscles tensing in preparation for the fight ahead. There was no going back now. The man who had been knocked out was starting to stir on the floor, but Jake couldn't afford to worry about him. The bigger threat was the group of armed men advancing toward them. Their faces were cold, their eyes filled with malice, and Jake could see from their posture that they weren't just any thugs. They were professionals, used to taking down their enemies quickly and without hesitation. The first man lunged at Jake, swinging a heavy fist. Jake dodged to the side, barely avoiding the blow. He wasn't going to let them take the girl back, not after everything they had been through. With a quick move, Jake grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back and slamming him against a nearby pillar. The man let out a grunt of pain, but Jake wasn't done yet. He followed up with a sharp knee to the stomach, sending the man to the floor, gasping for air. But Jake knew this wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't take on all of them by himself. He glanced back at the girl, his mind racing for a solution. "Run," he shouted, his voice firm. "Get out of here." She hesitated for a split second, but then, seeing the look in Jake's eyes, she bolted toward the nearest exit. Jake's heart clenched as he watched her go, but he knew she had to be the priority. He couldn't lose her now. The remaining men were closing in fast, but Jake wasn't going to let them get to her. He quickly assessed the situation, his instincts kicking in as he prepared to face the next wave of attackers. 2 men advanced, weapons drawn. Jake barely had time to react as one of them fired a shot, the bullet whizzing past his ear. He ducked behind a stack of crates, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had no choice but to fight his way out. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, but Jake didn't stay hidden for long. He couldn't afford to wait. He grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it at the first man who appeared from behind the crates. The blow landed with a sickening crack, and the man collapsed to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The other man charged at Jake, but this time, Jake was ready. He blocked the man's attack, using the momentum to throw him off balance. Jake followed up with a series of quick, brutal punches, knocking the man to the ground. But he wasn't done yet. As Jake turned to check on the girl, his heart sank. She had made it to the door, but she was stopped by another man standing outside. He was blocking her path, a sinister grin spreading across his face as he reached for her. Jake's instincts screamed at him to act. He sprinted toward the man, his legs moving faster than he thought possible. The man barely had time to react before Jake tackled him to the ground, sending him crashing into a pile of debris. The girl was safe for now, but Jake knew they weren't out of the woods yet. He stood over the man, catching his breath, his chest heaving. He had to get them both out of there, but he wasn't sure how much longer they had before more reinforcements showed up. He turned to the girl, his eyes locking with hers. "Come on, we need to go. Now," he urged, his voice laced with urgency. She nodded, her face pale but determined. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was ready. They both made a break for the exit, Jake keeping a protective distance in front of her as they sprinted through the darkened warehouse. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, but Jake didn't dare look back. They had to get out, and fast. As they reached the door, Jake kicked it open, the metal creaking in protest. He looked out into the night, his heart pounding. The street outside was empty, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her into the alleyway, moving quickly, not stopping to catch his breath. The danger was still looming. They weren't safe yet, but they were getting closer. They had made it this far, and Jake wasn't going to let anyone stop them now. As they ran through the alley, Jake's mind raced with thoughts of the next steps. He couldn't lead the girl to safety if he was caught, but he also couldn't leave her behind. They needed help, and fast. Jake glanced back one more time, his eyes scanning the street for any signs of pursuit. The coast was clear, but he knew they were being hunted. He had to stay ahead, no matter what. For her. For the girl who had trusted him when no one else would. As they turned the corner, Jake felt the weight of the situation press down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running, but for now it was enough. He would protect her. He would keep his promise. Jake's lungs burned as he pushed the girl faster, his eyes darting down the alley, scanning for any sign of pursuit. The rain had stopped, but the chill in the air made his skin crawl. His heart pounded in his chest as he focused on the sounds of their footsteps, the clatter of the girl's shoes against the wet concrete echoing in the stillness. They had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop. Jake glanced behind them again. No one had followed them yet, but he knew they wouldn't have much time. The sound of sirens in the distance was getting louder, and Jake didn't need to be a genius to know that it wasn't just the cops looking for them. They were after the girl, and they weren't going to stop until they had her. Jake led the girl into a small building at the end of the alley, one that looked abandoned but might offer them a temporary refuge. He slammed the door shut behind them, locking it quickly and then turning to the girl, his breath still ragged from the sprint. "We need to stay here for a minute," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. The girl nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling from the ordeal she'd already been through. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the responsibility for her safety heavier with every passing second. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep them both alive. "I'm scared," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake crouched down to her level, his expression softening for a moment. "I know, kid," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you're not alone. I won't let anyone hurt you. I promise." The girl nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. Jake couldn't blame her. He wasn't sure he believed his own words. He had made promises before, but this time was different. This time, there was no turning back. He had to find a way to get them both out of this. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Jake looked around the room they were in, a tiny storage space filled with old furniture and boxes. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out in the open. He pulled out his phone and dialed Murphy's number again. "Jake, what's going on?" Murphy answered immediately. "They're on us," Jake said, his voice clipped. "I need more info. Where is she going? Who are these people?" "I'm working on it," Murphy said. "But you're running out of time. They've got more people out looking for her. You need to move fast." Jake's pulse spiked. "How fast are we talking?" "Sooner than you think," Murphy replied. "These people aren't the type to give up easily. I've been digging into their connections. It's bad, Jake. Real bad." Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. What the hell do they want with her? Why is she so important? Murphy was silent for a moment. "I don't have all the details yet, but it's big. She's not just some random target. There's something they think she knows. Something they'll do anything to get their hands on." Jake's stomach tightened. It was worse than he thought. "You need to get her out of there," Murphy continued. "I'm sending you a location. It's a safe house, but you need to hurry." "Got it," Jake said. He hung up the phone and turned to the girl. She was still sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the fear that had taken root in her young heart. "We're going to get you somewhere safe," Jake said, his voice steady. "But we have to move quickly. Do you think you can do that?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty, but also a flicker of trust. "I can do it," she whispered, her voice small but determined. Jake gave her a small nod, then stood up, scanning the room once more. He had no idea how long they had before the people chasing them found this place, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He needed to get her to safety, and fast. He led her back to the door, checking once more to make sure they weren't being followed. The street outside was dark, the only light coming from distant street lamps. Jake's eyes searched the shadows for any signs of movement. He couldn't afford to get caught off guard now. He opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the street with the girl close behind him. They moved quickly, staying close to the buildings and out of the line of sight. Jake kept his senses sharp, alert for any sounds that might indicate they were being followed. His mind raced with possibilities. Where could they go? Who could they trust? His phone buzzed again. It was the location for Murphy. Jake quickly entered it into his map app, then motioned for the girl to follow. "This way," he said, keeping his voice low. They turned the corner and began walking, the tension in the air palpable. Every step felt like a countdown. They couldn't keep running forever. As they neared the safe house, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no one in sight. The street was quiet, too quiet. He couldn't afford to be complacent. They were almost there. Almost safe. Almost. But Jake knew better than to let his guard down. They hadn't made it yet. And if these people were as dangerous as Murphy said, they weren't going to stop until they had the girl. Jake's steps quickened as he led her toward the safe house, his mind running through the next moves. They were getting closer to safety, but danger was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jake's pulse raced as they neared the safe house, the weight of the situation bearing down on him with every step. He kept his pace steady, glancing over his shoulder one last time, ensuring they weren't being followed. The streets were empty, but something about the silence made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The girl walked close beside him, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. She didn't speak, but Jake could feel her fear, her uncertainty. He couldn't blame her. She had been through more in a few short days than most people would endure in a lifetime. As they approached the door to the safe house, Jake's senses were on high alert. The house itself was a nondescript building, tucked away behind a thick line of trees, the kind of place people might overlook. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of movement inside. This was the place they had to be. Jake knocked twice, then waited. He knew the rules: stay calm, stay focused. The door creaked, opened slowly, and a man in his late 40s appeared, his face lined with weariness. His eyes scanned the street before settling on Jake and the girl. "You made it," the man said, his voice a mixture of relief and caution. "Get inside, quickly." Jake nodded, pulling the girl inside with him, keeping his guard up. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and the man led them into a dimly lit living room. The place was small, furnished simply, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos they'd just escaped. The girl looked around, her wide eyes taking in everything, as if trying to make sense of it all. "Sit here," the man said, pointing to a worn couch in the corner. "You're safe now." Jake watched the girl as she sat down, her legs pulled up to her chest, her eyes still filled with fear. Jake couldn't help but feel responsible for what had happened, for what she had been through. He should have gotten to her sooner, should have stopped this before it ever started. But he had no time for regrets. There was still work to be done. He turned to the man. "How long can we stay here?" he asked, his voice low. The man, who Jake recognized as the contact Murphy had mentioned, glanced around the room, as if making sure there were no eavesdroppers. "Not long," he said. "These people, whoever they are, they'll find this place eventually. It's only a matter of time before they come looking for her again. But for now, you've got a few hours." Jake exhaled slowly, his mind working quickly. He had to find out more about who was after the girl, why they were so determined to get their hands on her. "Do you know who they are?" Jake asked, his voice steady. "I've been trying to dig," the man said, shaking his head. "But these guys are too deep. They're not just some street gang or low-level criminals. Whoever's behind this has power, connections. It's bigger than we thought." Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. He had always known the world he was involved in was dangerous, but this was something else entirely. And the girl was stuck in the middle of it. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice grim. "You need to get her out of here," the man said. "Get her to somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find her. And if you want to stop them, you need to get to the people who are pulling the strings." Jake nodded slowly. He knew what he had to do, but it wouldn't be easy, and there wasn't much time. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're going to need help. These people have eyes everywhere. You can't do this alone." Jake hesitated, considering the offer. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, but in this case, he had no choice. "Who do you know?" he asked. The man hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small piece of paper from his pocket, scribbling down a name and a phone number. "This is your contact. They can help you get to the people who are pulling the strings. But be careful. They won't hesitate to turn you in if they think you're a threat." Jake took the paper, tucking it into his jacket. "I'll be careful," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. There was no room for mistakes. "I'll make sure she's safe," he added, turning to the girl. She was still sitting on the couch, her eyes downcast, lost in thought. Jake walked over and knelt down in front of her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice reassuring. "We're not done yet, but I promise you, we're going to make it through this." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet hope. She nodded, though she still looked unsure. "I know you're scared," Jake continued, "but you're not alone. We're in this together." The girl didn't speak, but she took his hand in hers, squeezing it tightly. Jake's heart softened as he held her hand, the weight of the promise he had made to her mother pressing on his shoulders. He wasn't going to fail her. Not now. He stood up and turned back to the man. "Thanks for the help," he said, his voice firm. "We'll take it from here." The man nodded. "Just remember, you're running out of time. They won't stop looking for her." Jake didn't need the reminder. He knew the stakes. The next few hours were critical, and he had no idea what would happen when the sun rose. But for now, he had to focus on getting the girl out of harm's way and getting the answers he needed. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jake stepped out into the dim light of the alley, his mind racing. The safe house had given them a brief moment of respite, but that calm would not last long. He knew that as soon as the men he had fought earlier realized the girl had slipped from their grasp, they would come for her again, harder, faster. Jake had always been a man of action, and now he had a new mission. Protect the girl, get the answers, and deal with whoever was behind all this. His fingers tightened around the piece of paper with the contact name Murphy had given him. He had no choice but to trust it. There was no time to waste. He needed more information, and fast. Ready? Jake asked, turning to the girl who stood beside him. She nodded, her eyes a mix of fear and determination. The brief time they'd spent in the safe house had given her a small spark of hope, but Jake could see it in her face. She was still just a kid, still burdened by the terror she'd lived through. It wasn't fair. None of it was. I'll be right here, Jake added, trying to reassure her. We'll figure this out. They moved quickly through the back streets, staying away from the main roads where they could be spotted. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses alert to any signs of danger. The girl walked beside him, her eyes darting around nervously, but she kept up, trusting him to lead the way. They reached a quiet street, the kind that didn't get much traffic at night. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the piece of paper. His heart was pounding as it rang. He didn't know what to expect on the other end, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. The phone clicked, and a gruff voice answered. This is Stan. You the guy Murphy called? Jake's heart skipped a beat. Yeah, I need help. The girl's in danger. I don't know who's behind this, but they're not going to stop until they have her. There was a pause on the other end. You don't know what you're up against, Stan said finally. But I can help. Where are you? Jake quickly gave him their location, then hung up. He wasn't sure who this Stan guy was, but at this point, he didn't have the luxury of skepticism. They had to get to safety, and they needed to do it quickly. We're meeting someone, Jake told the girl, glancing at her. He's going to help us, but we need to keep moving. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the small glimmer of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving. As they walked, Jake's thoughts kept returning to the people who were after her. He still didn't understand why they wanted her. What did she know? Who was she really? He needed to find answers, and the only way to get them was to get to the people who had orchestrated this whole mess. As they approached a small parking lot, Jake's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Stan. Look for the blue van in the corner. Be careful. Jake pocketed the phone and glanced around. He spotted the van in the distance, parked under a flickering streetlight. His instincts screamed at him to be careful, but he had no choice but to go forward. He took a deep breath and led the girl toward the van. As they got closer, the side door slid open, and a man stepped out, his face partially hidden by a hood. You Jake? The man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Yeah, Jake replied, keeping his hand close to his side where he could reach his weapon if necessary. This is her, Jake added, gesturing to the girl. She's the one they're after. The man nodded, eyeing the girl with a look of caution. Get in, he said, stepping aside to let them into the van. Jake hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the area one last time. But there was no time to waste. He ushered the girl into the van and slid in beside her. The door slammed shut, and the man slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. As they drove off, Jake turned to the man. What now? He asked. Now we get answers, the man said, his tone cold and serious. But you're not going to like them. Jake's stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means you're involved in something bigger than you think. This isn't just some kidnapping. There's more going on, and it's all connected to her. Jake looked at the girl, sitting quietly beside him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. What does she know? He asked, his voice tight. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Finally, he spoke again. She's not just a victim. She's the key. Jake's mind raced, but he didn't have time to process it all. He had to focus on one thing at a time. Keep the girl safe. Get the answers. And stop whatever was coming before it was too late. Jake felt the weight of the words sink deep into his chest. The girl wasn't just a victim. She was the key. The key to what? What kind of game were they playing, and why was she the one they needed? He glanced at her, sitting quietly in the van, her face pale but determined. She had no idea what was really going on, but Jake was starting to see that the truth was bigger than either of them. The van sped through the streets, the hum of the tires on the asphalt the only sound in the otherwise tense silence. The The man at the wheel didn't speak. His eyes focused ahead as he navigated through the winding streets, clearly well aware of where he was going. Jake stayed quiet, his mind racing with all the possibilities. They were heading to an undisclosed location, a place that the man said would provide answers. But even as they approached their destination, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Every instinct he had screamed to stay cautious, to be ready for anything. He wasn't sure if this man, Stan, could be trusted, but he had no other choice. The girl was relying on him. They had to get the answers, and fast. As the van pulled into an industrial area, the buildings looming dark and abandoned in the distance, Jake's tension only grew. The area was quiet, too quiet, and the lights were dim. It felt like a place where things went to disappear. The van stopped in front of a metal door, and Stan turned off the engine. "This is it," he said, glancing at Jake. "Inside, you'll find the answers. But you need to be ready. They'll be watching." Jake nodded, stepping out of the van and motioning for the girl to follow. She hesitated for a moment, looking up at him with uncertainty in her eyes. But then she stepped out, clutching his hand tightly. As they approached the door, Jake couldn't help but feel like they were walking into the lion's den. Stan stepped forward and knocked twice, then once more, before the door creaked open. A man, tall and lean, stood in the doorway, his face stern and unreadable. "You're Jake, right?" the man asked, his voice deep and controlled. "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice steady, but inside, his mind was racing. "This is the girl," Jake said, motioning to the child. "We need answers. What's going on?" The man looked at the girl, his expression softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "Come inside," he said. The door closed behind them, and they entered a dimly lit room. A table sat in the center, covered with documents and pictures, but Jake barely registered them. His focus was on the man in front of him, who seemed to have all the answers. "We don't have much time," the man said, gesturing for them to sit. "There's a lot you don't know, and there's a reason they've been after her." He turned to the girl, who was standing quietly beside Jake. "She's the key to everything, the thing that can bring them down." Jake's stomach tightened as the words hung in the air. "Who are they?" Jake demanded. "They're a network, an organization that controls everything from politics to power, hidden in the shadows. They've been operating in plain sight for decades, and they've been looking for her because she's the only one who can expose them." Jake's mind was spinning. What does she know? How is she connected to all this? The man glanced at the girl before speaking. Her mother was once a part of them. She was a key player, someone who knew everything. But she left. She took her daughter and disappeared. He paused, watching Jake closely. But her mother made a mistake. She left behind clues. Clues that the organization is desperate to get their hands on. They know the girl has the answers. That's why they've been tracking her. Jake absorbed the words, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of information. The girl had no idea, no concept of the danger she was in. So what? Now, Jake asked, his voice low. "How do we stop them?" The man leaned in, his gaze piercing. "You can't stop them alone. But you can expose them. You have to get the information, and you have to be ready for the fight of your life. This is bigger than both of you." Jake took a deep breath, the weight of the mission settling heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just about protecting the girl anymore. It was about bringing down a criminal organization that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. "Where do we start?" he asked. The man pointed to a small stack of papers on the table. "That's the first step. You need to get to the headquarters. It's the last place they'll expect you." Jake nodded, taking the papers from the table and studying them quickly. He could feel the girl's presence beside him, her small hand still clutched in his. She was scared, but Jake could see the strength in her eyes. She was just a kid, but she had already seen the worst of what the world could throw at her. And now, it was up to him to make sure it didn't break her. "We'll do this," Jake said, his voice steady and resolute. "For her, and for the truth." The man nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. "Good. But remember, you're not alone. The fight isn't just yours anymore." Jake stood up, motioning for the girl to follow. It was time to move, time to take the fight to them. He had promised her mother that he would protect her, and now he was going to make sure that promise was kept. The road ahead would be dangerous, but Jake was ready. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. In this gripping tale of survival and mystery, Jake finds himself pulled deeper into the dangerous world of the Hells Angels. As the story unfolds, Jake becomes entangled with a young girl who holds the key to unraveling a dark conspiracy that threatens their lives. From tense confrontations to high-speed chases, Hell Angels stories reveal the raw courage and raw emotion of characters navigating through danger and betrayal. In this particular chapter, Jake's promise to protect the girl leads him into a life-or-death battle against ruthless enemies who will stop at nothing to find her. The Hells Angels have always been a symbol of power and defiance, and these stories showcase the strength and loyalty that members hold dear. As Jake digs deeper into the secrets surrounding the girl's past, the line between friend and foe blurs, and he must confront dangerous forces who are after much more than just revenge. In the end, these Hell Angels stories highlight themes of sacrifice, redemption, and the lengths one will go to protect those they love. Through every twist and turn, Jake's unwavering determination and bravery continue to shine as he faces challenges that no one should have to face. Whether you're a fan of Hell's Angels stories or a newcomer to the world of the Brotherhood, this tale will keep you on the edge of your seat as it reveals what happens when loyalty and honor are put to the ultimate test.